Good morning, it's Wednesday, March the 19th. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And my name's Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need for the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. And I have to say, it's quite something, Anne, even as there's a little bit of light as we wake up, in the second half of March to be down here in the kitchen and the temperature back below freezing again.
Wonderful, isn't it? But the good news is that by lunchtime, it should be 16 degrees, bright sunshine in Westminster when we go for our walks. And today's centrepiece is Prime Minister's questions. And there aren't any major set pieces beyond that, beyond some broadcast interviews with the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey, later today. And that means it's one of those days when we can pause and perhaps draw breath over the major developments, what's next for Ukraine after that call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and what's next for Labour after that showdown in the Commons over welfare cuts, and where both of those stories go next.
I'm one of those lucky people lining up to do an Ed Davey interview, so that'll take up a bit of my afternoon. But you're right, Anne. Today is a little bit about looking backwards, and I've read UK and US sites, and nothing symbolises that more than the incredible urgent trawl that seems to be going on over in the United States today, because one of the running stories to keep an eye on is that President Trump suddenly, with little notice, released the rest of the files into the 1963 assassination of JF Kennedy. The instruction came late Tuesday by the president, and basically his officials have had to scramble, and suddenly 1,123 PDF documents have been dumped on websites, and historians, journalists and conspiracy theorists are going through those at pace. And I can tell you, as of 7:15 in the morning UK time, it does appear like Lee Harvey Oswald still killed the president. Breaking.
But for me, I'm getting the Cold War shivers, because this is we are going to hear a bit more about that alleged KGB involvement there. At the same time, split screen where we have Vladimir Putin, a graduate of the KGB school of Soviet Russian leadership, also making world news. But let's start the morning with everyone trying to make sense of that call between Putin and Trump. So Sam, do you want to give us the basics?
So everyone, including Downing Street, really has been trying to piece together what on earth is going on, mostly from the US side. Now, we are told that President Putin and President Trump spoke for between 90 minutes and 2 hours. At the end, Putin agreed to halt attacks, but not on everything, just on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And that is less of a victory for President Trump than he would have wanted. He wanted a general ceasefire. The Russian leader instead saying that he was only going to stop the targeting of Ukrainian power stations for 30 days and agreeing to future peace talks, but wouldn't sign up to the kind of US proposed deal in the same way that President Zelensky has done. And that was clearly what Donald Trump wanted to announce. The White House has said that those future negotiations will be technical negotiations on the implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, a full ceasefire, and then a permanent peace. And that's going to happen in the Middle East. Those talks are going to happen in the Middle East. But clearly, we did not get an agreement as far as President Trump and the White House were hoping. But that is what our understanding is from the US side. However, of course, my co-host is one of the very few Russian specialists, ex-Moscow resident, and somebody who has been spending the early hours, trawling through those Kremlin websites in Russian to actually give us the real situation from the Russian side. So, Anne, do you want to tell us what went down and what is being said in Russia, in Moscow, about that call?
Oh yes, my early morning trawl of the Kremlin websites. What a joy. The Moscow official version of this, I find it very interesting, Sam, what Putin chooses, or his team choose to put in front of the Russian people. This is the official version that then goes out through, of course, all of that massively controlled Russian media. So they do say that it's a noble goal to end the war and aim for, quotes, a comprehensive, reliable and lasting peace. And I read that phrase, it's a sort of answer to the just and lasting peace that Ukraine and Ukraine's allies talk about. So every time Ukraine comes up with a talking point or something to focus attention on, Moscow says, yes, we kind of think the same thing, except the words mean something rather different. And you very quickly get into a tone that is very Putin. It is that rather harsh. It's the old KGB officer, the eliminating the root cause of the crisis and respecting legitimate security interests. I'm sorry, but they really do write like this. There's talk of that forced mobilization in Ukraine. And that is something, of course, that Putin has been a talking point he's been pushing on to Donald Trump and his team. And Trump's team have sometimes repeated this. So always undermining the legitimacy there of Volodymyr Zelensky as a war leader, talking about barbaric acts of terrorism, etc., committed on Russian soil. So what do we read into this? Well, you don't need to go far between the lines to hear this drumbeat that Ukrainians are really just confused Russians, and that the root causes of the war are Zelensky, you remember all that stuff about the neo-Nazi leadership in Kyiv, and NATO. And that bodes pretty badly for ideas like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron talking about peacekeepers or sort of intermediate forces, but linked into that NATO security architecture. It's all about the neutral idea, demilitarizing. A lot of all this talk is really about saying you're not going to get any sort of military infrastructure or support on the ground in Ukraine as far as Putin is concerned. What do you make of it?
So as far as I can tell, that would seem to imply that there are very few grounds for optimism at this point, because the basis for any kind of deal would have to involve the kinds of concessions that I think not only President Zelensky would not sign up to, but also Keir Starmer and many European allies. In the end, if the only deal that the Russians will do is around a demilitarized zone, effectively what he's saying is, can we remove all troops, including non-Ukrainian troops, but presumably also Ukrainian ones as well, from the area bordering Russia? And you can see the obvious problem with that for European countries and for Ukraine, the fear that, there will be some kind of excuse in years to come for Russia to go back in, and it will have become a lot easier because suddenly the territory immediately to the west of it is undefended. And so that doesn't feel like the basis of something that most world leaders could sign up to. But the problem is that Donald Trump is not most world leaders. And one of the starkest things that you're looking at this morning is the different types of reaction from different leaders. So obviously, President Zelensky says that this shows that President Putin can't sign up to a peace deal, which is true. But on the US side, they were much, much more optimistic about kind of what was said. And Donald Trump seems so desperate to present this as a win that he is downplaying the kind of problems evident from space about the tactical and strategic position that Moscow is setting out.
Also, perhaps to just take note of, although it's sort of wrapped up in the language of friendship, the Kremlin saying Donald Trump has agreed to a suggestion by Putin, as they put it very firmly, that there should be a friendly ice hockey match between the two countries. And this is really a playbook going way back to the Cold War, and it's intended to underline the bilateral nature of this. Everybody else, the Muppets, they could do what they're doing, but the two countries that really matter here in this way of looking at the world are America and Russia. But of course, Cold War obsessives will remember the Miracle on Ice Olympics, Winter Olympics game in 1980 between the two countries, with the two teams absolutely tore lumps out of each other. In fact, Russia lost that one, and the entire team, great in the history of Soviet sport, this went into the annals. The whole team got dressing down one by the coach, and they never inscribed their silver medals. So if that ever comes to pass, I think that will definitely be something we'll be talking about on the podcast the next day.
Absolutely. On the US side, Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Steve Witkoff, who met with Putin to help set the stage for that call last night, has been given interviews, and he said that basically the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, they're all going to Saudi Arabia for further talks. So there is still a process underway. But just one point on where this leaves the UK. It strikes me that one of the goals of Ukraine, the EU and the UK is to message President Trump that President Putin can't be trusted. It's almost like the way the UK, the other members of the coalition, the willing, are trying to use these talks is to say, look, you think you can do a deal with President Putin. That is simply not the case. He cannot be trusted. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to me that that message is particularly landing with Putin, and that strategy of trying to basically divide Putin and Trump and undermine the trust that Trump claims to have for Putin has particularly had any effect yet. Now we're in the nitty-gritty of the negotiations. And finally, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary here, is, according to Bloomberg, now discussing the possibility of basically flooding the zone, flooding Ukraine with weaponry before any ceasefire is announced. So in order, he would argue that it was in order to give Ukraine the biggest possible leverage, the biggest possible position of strength. But if the basis of a peace deal or the basis of Putin approaching these talks is around demilitarized zones and reducing armaments and weaponry, that will presumably inject greater tension into what's going on. And actually, at the moment, it doesn't feel to me like we are on the verge of any breakthrough here. There are too many things pulling in different directions. And so it doesn't, although there are talks and there are processes, I can't quite see how we get quickly from here.
No, indeed. And I think the other aim is clearly to separate off US-Russia relations from European allies and just make it harder and harder to put anything like those peacekeeping putative plans together, because, in that scenario, well, where is the room then to get in there and make any plans like that?
Right, we should flip over to welfare. I'm sure that this will come up at Prime Minister's Questions with Keir Starmer at lunchtime. By the way, watch the Sky News website. We're going to try an innovation during Prime Minister's Questions where I give a live commentary all the way through. So have a look on the Sky website and app for that, if that's your thing. Might not be. But the welfare debate is grinding on. Yesterday, Liz Kendall stood up in the House of Commons and outlined the plan that, really the one that we were discussing on the podcast yesterday, but it's all about the reaction now. Largely, it was the usual suspects rather than a huge, great upswell of Labour MPs who spoke out in public. There will have to be votes to change some of the things that the government announced yesterday, which is painful. The great big omission is an understanding of exactly how much the savings will generate, exactly how much basically Liz Kendall has helped Rachel Reeves, and therefore how much the remaining heavy lifting needs to be done next week in the spring statement to make sure that Rachel Reeves doesn't miss her fiscal rules. All of that kind of stuff pushed off. So it's a little unclear how much additional cuts to public services that Rachel Reeves will still need to do if she's to maintain her headroom, maintain her wiggle room against her fiscal rules. One really interesting point, though, is Stephen Bush, the chief political commentator for the Financial Times. Now, he was on a rival podcast, Coffee House Shots, and he just lifted the lid on something that I hadn't known before, which is there's a very, very active debate that goes on at moments like these between the Treasury and the OBR. And Rachel Reeves actually has somebody, he says, on the Council of Economic Advisors whose job it is really to convince the OBR that measures that the government says promote growth really do and should be kind of recognised as that, and things like the welfare measures do actually generate the savings that he said. So John Van Riener, eminent economist, possible winner of a future Nobel Economics Prize, is at the heart of the debate, arguing on Rachel Reeves' behalf that all of these measures generate more savings, and the growth measures will mean higher GDP in future. Very active debate that, apparently. That's just something I didn't know about the process, but absolutely key to the question of, will Rachel Reeves have to squeeze public spending between 2026 and 2029 when she stands up next week?
I'm interested also in where this leaves the mood on the Labour benches, and particularly those MPs who've been wavering or downright furious about these proposals, Sam. And what I'm watching is what's happening on the Labour benches and that attempt at charm offensive, as it's been put to the playbook, the Politico playbook this morning, to keep briefing MPs until they give in and full-throatedly support these welfare reforms. So we have Stephen Timms, Alison McGovern, Liz Kendall herself out there talking to MPs on the phone pretty much all the time when they're not in the chamber or actively involved in talks with other ministers. And it really is a very hard sell that is having to go on. And one of the points that I hadn't realised, I suppose yesterday brought it a bit to a head, a very punchy defence of the cuts by Liz Kendall. I thought she was pretty impressive in the Commons and taking the fight to the potential rebels. But we haven't seen the impact assessment yet. And when that really lands in the spring statement next week, is that going to be another moment dragging out the story of Labour discontent for another week? Or is that the moment when everything moves on and it turns out to have been, if you like, a rebellion in a nutshell? I'm not sure about that. What do you think?
The one genuinely new fact that I hadn't really appreciated that kind of bubbled up yesterday came from the independent analysis of what Liz Kendall was announcing, people like the IFS and the Resolution Foundation. And, these facts end up on the front page of the newspapers. And, under the rules that are changing, people who might have a degree of difficulty with one activity in daily life, like struggling with washing or dressing or eating, and if it's just one of them, rather than perhaps four, they'll be denied support. And that will cost them between £4,200 and £6,300 a year. The sum of the losses for some people in this process who are going to be the losers, those are eye-watering sums. I remember covering George Osborne's attempts to cut tax credits, and that could have taken, over the course of a year, four-figure sums out of the pockets of those who are least well off in this country, those who are working least well off. These sums for people who struggle with life, whether or not they should qualify or not for the kind of disability payments is the question at the heart of it. But just the sheer sum of money that they are about to lose is pretty eye-watering, and I hadn't appreciated it was on that scale, a large amount of money from not necessarily a huge amount of people.
And when you look in the big picture, that narrative that Liz Kendall was pursuing yesterday, we're really here to sort of help you get into work if you can, but also this is unaffordable, etc. It all makes sense. I think what we will see across the next week is a lot of MPs who will be certainly briefing my colleagues at Politico and you at Sky and beyond will be saying, well, yeah, but actually when you look into the numbers, when you look at the actual impacts, and you'll be able to cite concrete cases of what this is going to mean for a certain kind of person, I wonder whether that is going to start this whole argument running again.
One final thought. All of this, a lot of this, is to try and help Rachel Reeves with her fiscal rules. But a lot of this doesn't come in immediately. Some of the measures announced yesterday will take a couple of years. I do wonder whether, if things get a little bit better, there is scope to soften some of the changes if growth improves and the government and those negotiations with the OBR go slightly better, whether all of the package announced yesterday finally comes in, because this is in part about saving the Chancellor and trying to stop her having to squeeze too much elsewhere. And you probably heard the alarm, which means our time is up. Thank you very much indeed. We will be back tomorrow for Thursday's edition of Politics at Sam and Anne's. We hope to join you then.
See you then.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.